My presentation will give a chronological summary of some of the artwork I've created over the last 12 years. For starters, I got my bachelor degree in fine arts from NSCAD University, majoring in video production, and with a minor in sculpture. My subject matter is often about modern times, current events, and the social and historical significance of our era. So what was happening 12 years ago? This was pre-9/11. Bill Clinton was president and Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister of Canada. The internet was in its infancy. The cloning of mammals had begun, sheep, goats, and very probably humans. The human genome had also been mapped, and the International Space Station was under construction. Everything was peachy back then. And I thought to myself, what an incredible time to be making art. Science fiction was becoming science fact. It was a new era where you could break down the building blocks of life and reconfigure them into something completely new. So I began to make artworks such as human-animal hybrids with Photoshop. This was my mom's 1970s typewriter that I disassembled and reassembled into a robot arm. Junk technology mostly made in China was piling up. So I began to make sculptures with these discarded cultural objects. Also around this time, George W. Bush was selected to be the President of the United States, and a new era of belligerent nationalism, corporatism, and propaganda ensued. And on September 11, 2001, a new televised war had begun for our viewing pleasure. I began to make some performance art video skits to raise awareness of the more important scientific and ethical issues around genetic engineering and cloning. I dressed up in a quasi-hazmat spacesuit and created a fascist character named Mavis. He was a pro-cloning dictator trying to take over the world, but only went on to hijack a G8 protest and get on the 6 o'clock news.
And it may seem a little ironic, but the anti-capitalist demonstrations are fueling the economy in some surprising ways. Just ask a couple of local filmmakers. No one is free when others are oppressed. That's the message that thousands of these protesters are sending today, but these two guys are different. They have their own agenda. Why are you here?
Staging the Mavis Performance Art videos proved to be rather time-consuming and slightly dangerous, so it was more cost-effective to simply steal copywritten footage from television and remix it into rogue activist-style propaganda videos, or mashups. I made about 20 or 30 mashups, including the one where I made George W. Bush say he was a fascist.
From this day forward, we will follow in the path of fascism, Nazism, and totalitarianism.
And many other mashups that explored genetic engineering, war, terrorism, and our technological evolution. In 2006-ish, I was really frustrated about our materialistic culture and generally pissed off with our capitalist system, so I ripped up over $2,000 and glued it back to canvas to create United We Spend. These pieces were in the Canadian War Museum, the Bank of Canada's Currency Museum, and the Canada flag was finally sold last year at a special event at the National Art Gallery of Canada. In 2006, I landed a strange video contract to produce propaganda videos for the Army under General Rick Hillier. After spending 2 years making propaganda for D&D, I felt inspired and compelled to make my last mashup video, In God We Trust, which depicts the holy war that George W. Bush brought upon Iraq and still continues in the Middle East today.
And God bless. And God bless.
I pray for God's comfort and God's healing powers.
May God bless America. Nuclear holy warriors.
May God bless America.
Holy, holy warriors. Placing our confidence in the loving God behind all of life and all of history. May He guide us now, and may God continue to bless the United States of America.
This video is also available on YouTube for free. In 2007-2008, I grew immensely tired and frustrated with the direction the world was going, so I simply smashed, burned, and shredded shit to pieces. I made a video where I smashed the shit out of a persistently noisy organ, and another where I set a robotic fish on fire as it sang "Don't Worry, Be Happy."
Don't worry, be happy. Don't worry, be happy.
And of course, I continued to rip up money and glue it back to canvas. And finally in 2008, everything would change. Saint Obama was elected, and we would now finally venture down the path of peace, solar energy, electric cars, genetic cures, and lock up all the Wall Street crooks. But that shift never happened, and I began to reflect on the last 100 years and explore the good old days, and where our civilization's train fell off its tracks.
When did progress digress?
Around 2009, I went through a huge artistic shift. Our history and past technologies became a focal point. I spent weeks in the archives looking at old photographs and films of people that came before us. I began collecting their possessions, like this radio, and learned how to restore them. I developed an appreciation and admiration for their old school artwork, their beautiful music, and their timeless architecture. It was about 2009-2010 when I bought my studio and I simply lost it. I inexplicably began buying up radios, TVs, typewriters, cameras, microphones, test equipment, antique picture frames, usually bad and terrible condition. I didn't know then what I would do with these materials, but it just felt right. These century-old remnants would be the base materials of the largest body of work I would create to date. And create I did. Over 75 new artworks in the past 2 years.
These were the first 3 pieces I made in late 2011.
Over here you can see that I got this 1902 telephone that I found in the garbage, and I restored it to look virtually new, and then I mounted in an MP3 player. So when you pick up the handle and listen to it, it plays 1,000 songs from 1920 to 1940. So that one's I forgot about those tunes. This one up here is Rebirth of the Cool. That was just my first piece that I wanted to make. And then of course you had the electric witch detector, which kind of like turns on and blinks and makes beeping noises when witches. I was initially going to call it the communist detector or maybe the socialist detector, but anyway, the witch detector it is. I made a series of planetary portraits using 1930s turntables, vintage rabbit fur, and scrap metal from the 1920s, framed in vintage and antique frames. These are some really neat pieces. There's the electric orbit machines, which were turntables, some of them spinning as the motor still working from the 1930s. And then some other portraits of planets and moons and stuff. And then the portrait of the universe. This was a really weird optical illusion where I created this ball with a reflective innards, and then these lights you put inside, and they kind of like float there magically. It looks kind of like a star system, just these lights suspended with no wires or anything. I continued to make pieces that address current social and historically relevant issues and raise awareness of issues of our time, but with an archival and historical aesthetic. So for example, in this one, the Trans-Canadian Pipeline, it's a caribou antler that's been severed by a metal strip that represents the pipelines. And over here we have a 1913 picture frame of the Cunard Line and a 1950s toy train that has fallen off its tracks in progress derailed. So this one here up at the top left, Endangered Species, has got a little video running of my eye blinking there, and it's in a super old frame, and that's a shark jaw. And then below that is the two little space characters. They're Buck Rogers toys from the 1970s of space oddities. And then up there in the corner there is it's an 1880s frame, the Spiritual Readometer. That's some 1930s test equipment with an 1880s picture frame. And then below that is the Evolution of Greed. Pretty self-explanatory. The picture on the left here, has anybody seen this guy's dad? And it's the astronaut's asking that question as he holds a crucifix with Jesus hanging on the cross up in the outer space. So he's gone up in outer space and he's looking for God, I guess, with Jesus. And then to the right of that is a bullshit market. It's a transparent cow, and it just demonstrates what's really going on in the market today, and that it's a bunch of bullshit. And then I just decided I'd start making bombs. So bomb art. On the left you can see there that there's again one of these old 1880s picture frames, and inside that is some old radio components from the 30s and an old telephone punch dial, but it does look a lot like a bomb, and that's you can get closer to God. So there's with all the violence and terrorism and suicide bombers that you see. And then on the right you can see that ceci n'est pas une bombe, and that's a little bit of a play tongue-in-cheek on Magritte, ceci n'est pas une pomme. And as you can see, I made a Microsoft bomb. The Microsoft label is on the bottom part, and it's attached to an Apple logo. And that can be interpreted 2 different ways. One is that Microsoft is trying to blow up Apple, or 2 is that it's a Microsoft and Apple that have both exploded on the world. Hunting Dissent is probably my most recent piece. It was inspired by a global rash of protests, the silencing and oppression of dissent both here and abroad, media blackouts on the Occupy movement, Jean Charest's legislation to oppress protesters during the student movement, and the like. It evokes the idea that the protester is nothing more than a game animal for the wealthy and corrupt corporations and governments to simply dismiss. We certainly live in interesting times, and what an incredible time to be making art. A lot of my earlier work was very short video art, and it can be found easily online on YouTube and through my website. If you were so inclined to go watch one video, I would recommend In God We Trust, which can be found on my website. Thank you Remco and Pecha Kucha, and good night.